the road, that we can be preventative in ourselves early on to prevent those things from happening. And some of the tips that she gave, and she was big on sleep too, and she said that there's some tips that I found really helpful that stuck with me. One of them was she was saying that, sleep is essential, but not everybody can get to sleep early. She said that the electronics, the Blu-ray off of our laptops, the computers, phones, television, actually depletes melatonin and in our brain. So it stimulates and it causes us to lose REM sleep. So she says to turn off the electronics at least 1 hour before trying to go to sleep. And then she also said to take a hot shower or hot bath right before bed, because once we get into the sheets, it drops our core body temperature and it'll help us get right to sleep and sleep better. And those are things. Great. And she also said to dim the lights. The fluorescent lights are striking are stimulating as well. But when you set an ambiance within the room where it's lamps instead, or candles, or just dimmer lighting, not so bright, it helps relax the home. And she recommends that at least 2 hours before sleeping. And then she had said a little bit more about nutrition, to watch our diet and to make sure that we try to eat healthy foods to prevent things down the road from happening. And I found those things helpful. And I know there's people thinking out there, well, how are we going to turn off our electronics for an hour? Then what do we do?
Right.
She says that's time for reading, or talking on the phone is okay, or listening to music, or even intimacy, or reading a book with your child, things of that nature, instead of being on electronics or watching TV before bed. And there's some people that feel like they can't sleep without the TV on, and actually that's kind of counterproductive. It's really funny.
Right. And, on the screen time on the electronics, you probably know this, but most of the smartphones have got these screen time apps now where, you turn it on and then it tells you how much time you're spending with your screen turned on every day, which, let me tell you, the first time I did that, I was just mortified. I mean,
what was yours at?
Well, I don't even want to tell you what it was. I mean,
come on, fess up.
It was bad.
23 hours?
No. Actually, it was on I think it was on a Saturday, and I turned the thing on. And of course, I'm sitting there, and keep in mind, it's counting like when you're looking at email, when you're doing texting. I mean, anything where you're looking at the face of your phone is counted in that. So anyway, that being said, that day I had something like 3.5 hours of screen time, and I thought, oh my gosh, that's a lot of time. But I could have probably been doing something else that may have been more worthwhile. But you can set that up where it'll give you these reports, and you can see you can kind of monitor your screen time, which is interesting.
Screen time guilt trip.
Yeah, guilt trip.
That's a good app.
Yeah.
Screen time guilt trip app. Put it on your child's phone and say, see. I keep running out of data just because I share a phone plan with my son and I don't have unlimited. And so then it goes in safety mode, and then it becomes, and if he's listening, yes. No. So then it goes over the data, and then it goes into safety mode. And so,
right.
I mean, that's enough said too. If you have a large data plan and you keep going over, that means it's probably getting overused as well.
Yep. So you want to talk about a different kind of self-care?
Sure.
Okay, so here's one that I don't think people think about as much as like the sleep and the nutrition and the physical activity. And this has to do with something called self-compassion, which means that you want to be kind to yourself when you're having a rough day. You don't want to be overly self-critical. You want to accept that we all have flaws, and you want to forgive yourself when you have some shortcoming. And so that can actually be a terrific way that we can manage some of the more difficult emotions that we all experience. And I think that's another really key thing that needs to be part of our self-care.
Right. Well, how do we be kinder to ourselves? Self-compassion, that's a great term. I like that.
Yeah.
So how do we use that?
I think the first step is always first you make some intentional statement that, okay, I'm going to try to do this. And so then the next time you make a mistake, instead of beating yourself up for it, which usually is what we do, mentally.
We're always our worst enemy, right? Our own worst enemy.
Way. So we would reframe that. We would say, I did my best. I can always do better. I can try again. I can try something different the next time. But there's no point in just telling myself what a loser I am. And so that's one simple way you can begin to reframe it in a way that is more positive.
Absolutely. We should be our own best friend rather than our own worst enemy. And I'm definitely guilty of being overly critical on myself and really hard on myself. So how are ways if you're programmed to think like that, what are some tools to maybe help redirect negative self-talk?
Yeah, so as you well know, as a therapist, this is a lot of what we sometimes do in therapy, and you help people begin to identify some of these patterns that are negative thoughts. Then after a while you realize, oh my gosh, I'm doing this all the time. I'm so critical to myself. I see everything as a catastrophe. I'm blaming myself all the time. So you begin to recognize the patterns, and that's when you then can take the step to intervene and do the positive reframe in a way that takes away a lot of that negative, kind of emotion that goes along with it. And so you first have to recognize the pattern, and then you have to, again, be intentional about stepping in and putting that positive spin on it so that you can begin to treat yourself better.
Mm-hmm. Right. It takes some practice to notice the patterns of behavior and notice and catch ourselves giving ourselves a hard time.
Oh, absolutely. Totally takes practice. And this is something that, you can either get help in counseling if you want to learn more about this. There's some pretty good self-help materials that you can find on this kind of thing. But it's basically the idea of kind of looking for these patterns of negative thinking and finding ways that we can put those in a more realistic and less self-critical kind of light.
What is a way to track those patterns of thinking that you suggest?
One simple way, and we a lot of times will teach people this in the context of counseling or therapy, but you can just get a piece of paper and you can write 3 columns on it, and you can have A, B, and C. And so A is just where you have what we would call the affect or the mood. So A stands for affect, but it really means mood. And so okay, I'm mad. So you write down mad. And then the second column, B, is your belief or your thought. So it's like you're thinking to yourself, what a loser I am. And then C is the consequence, which is okay, I must be a terrible person, or, I need to go drink a fifth of alcohol, or I need to do something bad to myself. And so you begin to see this pattern. And so then once you establish kind of this pattern, you see this happen over and over and over again, then we're actually going to add a 4th column, which we're going to call D, and that's where you begin to dispute it, or you begin to substitute in the more positive or the more self-compassionate thought. And so, that's a very simple sort of interpretation of a lot of what we do in therapy, that's sort of cognitive behavioral therapy. Mm-hmm. But it's a way to help us identify when we have a negative mood, we have a negative thought, we have some adverse consequence, and then we learn a way to really reframe it in a way that begins to help us think more positively.
Well said. It seems like some clients would think that's a lot of work, but it takes a lot of work for us to be able to reprogram, because it took years for us to be programmed to negative self-talk. So it will take effort for us to immediately have automatic positive thinking.
It absolutely does. It does take some work.
It doesn't happen overnight.
No, and many of these, patterns and habits that we're in, they're well ingrained over years. Mm-hmm. And so, it's not going to change overnight, but it's the kind of thing sort of like exercising a muscle. If we begin to work at it, we're going to get stronger. And then over time, we're going to begin to notice a difference.
So another example, let's say a negative. And, also, I'm sidebarring here, but if for those of us with kids, a lot of times it's contagious. So let's say we have negative self-talk, and I'm just going to spin off on what Dr. Susman, David, is saying, is that sometimes if we have negative self-talk, we say it out loud. And if you ever catch yourself just gosh, I'm an idiot, or gosh, that was dumb, or man, I shouldn't have done that, or overwhelmed. Kids pay attention to that. And even if we're just talking to ourselves out loud, but if we're saying it out loud, then they start thinking the same thing. And I've had clients come into my office where I'm working with the child, and it sounds like they're saying adult things and they're picking it up from their parents who are overwhelmed and having the negative. Even if they're not saying it to the child, just saying it out loud to themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And, is it any wonder that our kids, they see what we do and they do the same thing? I mean, it happens all the time. So what we're doing in front of them, around them, I mean, they're soaking it up like a sponge. And of course they're going to learn, how to behave many times the same way we behave. So that's, I'll be first to tell you, I'm not an expert in working with children. That hasn't been a large part of my work, but that is absolutely, that's how kids learn.
Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, we can tell them they're enough, but then they're looking at us with, and we're the role models and thinking, well, if I'm enough, then why aren't you thinking that about yourself?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, parents can teach kids the self-compassion in the same way, because they can teach them, okay, so you did something and it didn't work out right. Again, you don't, as a child, you don't have to beat yourself up or criticize yourself. You can, look for what you did well and look for ways to improve and look for ways to do better the next time.
Absolutely. But we have to practice what we preach in order for it to stick, which is something that is just really hard for a lot of people to do. What are some other, so sleep, physical activity. If you're not saying exercise, what are some physical activity things that you suggest?
Well, I think this is really personal, and everybody's got to look at what they like. There's I wish I had thought of the name of this book. There's a great book, which I'll think of in a minute, but it talks about sort of reframing this idea of physical or exercise into physical activity. And the reason for that is when we think about exercise, we get demoralized. But when we think about physical activity, that might just be taking a walk at lunch or walking the dog, or it might be some stretching or some yoga, or it might be taking a walk in the park. Anything that gets us moving, we've seen over and over again, the research shows that there's really great health benefits from that. So I think, again, if we're kind of using this trick of reframing things and getting away from the idea, it has to be, going to a gym and working out, that it can be all kinds of different physical activity that can be really pleasant and really enjoyable. People sometimes don't realize you can get a huge amount of benefit from those kind of things as well.
And even spending time outdoors. And I know that it's harder for those of you guys that are up north, and if it's snowing or very cold, but to catch fresh air, to spend time outside, even if it's a little bit, at least locally in Florida, to be at a park or to be out in nature is not only great for depression, for fighting depression, for the vitamin D, everything. The sunshine is essential for fighting those things. Yeah.
Oh, hey, I remembered the name of the book. So I have no financial interest in this book, but I want to plug it anyway. The book is called No Sweat, and it's written by PH.D., and it talks about this idea of sort of reframing how we think about physical activity to be more motivational. And so I would highly recommend that book. It's called No Sweat.
Okay. So it's basically teaching about self-care?
It's really basically teaching more about the idea of physical activity as a form of self-care and how to use sort of simple motivation to get past this idea that exercise has to be, the sweating in the gym kind of thing, that it can be much more than that. And so that's
why
really,
it says no sweat.
It's kind of narrowly focused on the whole physical activity thing, but it's a great book. It's really good.
That makes sense. That taking care of yourself isn't always going into the gym, because some people can't physically actually do things like that. But there's other times they say also to take your dog for a walk after work, and make sure you take your lunch break and take your sick leave at work. There's so many people that are saying, "Oh, I had all this vacation time that I never used, and it's rolling over," or they lost it. And according to statistics on mental health and wellness, it recommends for us to take our sick leave and go for a walk at lunchtime, or at least definitely take your lunch break. the regular sleep routine is essential. I don't know anyone in the helping profession that doesn't say get a good night's sleep.